Most people think they understand relationships. They believe attraction is simple, loyalty is obvious, and interest is easy to recognize. But the truth is far more uncomfortable than most people are willing to admit. Human behavior is rarely as honest as people's words. In fact, some of the most important truths in relationships are never spoken out loud. They are revealed quietly through behavior, through small changes in attention, and through subtle shifts that most people completely overlook. What if I told you that there are certain psychological signs that reveal when someone's emotional focus has already moved somewhere else, long before they ever admit it? Signs that appear in the way they speak, the way they respond, the way their attention shifts, and even in the way they carry themselves. Most people miss these signals because they are too focused on what they hope is true instead of what behavior is actually showing them. The reality is that people rarely expose their intentions directly. They protect their image, they soften the truth, and sometimes they convince themselves that nothing has changed. But behavior never lies for very long. Patterns always begin to reveal what words try to hide. And once you understand these patterns, something powerful happens. You stop guessing, you stop chasing reassurance. You stop confusing attention with genuine interest. Instead, you begin seeing relationships through a completely different lens, one based on psychology rather than emotion. In this video, we are going to break down 8 powerful signs that expose when someone's attention, validation, and emotional focus may already be invested somewhere else. Some of these signs are subtle, some are uncomfortable, and some may completely change the way you look at relationships forever. But if you stay until the end, you will understand something that most people spend years trying to figure out. Because once you learn how to read behavior instead of believing words, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Let me begin with a principle that many people hear, but very few truly understand. Human beings are excellent storytellers, but they are often unreliable narrators of their own behavior. People will explain, justify, defend, and sometimes completely rewrite their actions with words that sound convincing. But the most consistent truth about human nature is this: behavior always reveals what words try to hide. If you want to understand someone, you should not focus on what they promise. You should focus on what they repeatedly do. Because behavior is the language of priorities. It exposes where attention goes, where energy is invested, and where emotional loyalty truly exists. Many people misunderstand relationships because they listen too carefully to explanations and not carefully enough to patterns. They wait for confessions. They wait for direct evidence. They wait for a moment where the truth is openly admitted. But psychology rarely works like that. The truth in human relationships is rarely announced. It is displayed gradually through small shifts that most people overlook. Think about attention for a moment. Attention is not unlimited. Every human being has a finite amount of emotional energy in a day. We can only give so much curiosity, care, conversation, and presence. When that attention begins to move somewhere else, the shift becomes visible in subtle ways. You might notice conversations becoming shorter. You might notice enthusiasm slowly fading. You might notice that questions about your life become less frequent. None of these changes appear dramatic at first. In fact, they often appear so small that people ignore them. They tell themselves that the person is simply tired, busy, distracted, or stressed, and sometimes that explanation is true. But when these patterns begin to repeat consistently, something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Human beings do not withdraw attention randomly. Attention follows emotional investment. Where interest grows, attention flows. And where attention flows, behavior begins to change. This is why the first signal that something in a relationship has shifted is not usually an argument or a confrontation. It is distance. Quiet, subtle distance that slowly changes the atmosphere between two people. The warmth of conversation begins to cool. The sense of curiosity begins to fade. The energy that once felt present now feels distracted. And the interesting thing about human psychology is that people often believe they can hide this change. They assume that if they say the right things or maintain basic communication, the shift will go unnoticed. But emotional absence has a very distinct signature. Even when someone is physically present, their mind can be somewhere else entirely. You may have experienced this yourself at some point in your life. Sitting with someone who appears to be listening, yet their responses feel delayed, shallow, or disconnected. It feels as though they are there, but not truly there. That subtle disconnection is rarely accidental. It usually reflects a divided emotional focus. When another person begins to occupy someone's thoughts, their behavior adjusts accordingly, not necessarily with dramatic betrayal or obvious signs, but with gradual changes in engagement. This is because emotional investment creates psychological gravity. It pulls attention, imagination, and energy toward the new focus of interest. Now, here is where many people make a critical mistake. Instead of observing behavior calmly, they try to force reassurance. They ask direct questions, hoping the person will clarify everything. But most of the time, those answers do not reveal much, because when someone is internally conflicted, they will often protect their image rather than expose their actions. So they explain, they rationalize, they reassure, but behavior continues telling a different story. And this is why emotional intelligence is not about interrogating people. It is about observing patterns without becoming emotionally reactive. When you step back and watch behavior objectively, the truth becomes surprisingly clear. Consistency always exposes reality. If someone truly values your presence, you will not have to analyze every conversation, wondering whether they care. Interest naturally expresses itself through effort. Curiosity appears naturally when someone is emotionally invested, and presence feels unmistakable when attention is genuine. But when that investment shifts somewhere else, the difference becomes visible through absence rather than confession. You begin to notice that you are the one initiating most conversations. You begin to notice that your stories receive shorter responses. You begin to notice that the emotional energy between you is no longer balanced. These moments are not accidents, they are signals that something within the dynamic of the relationship has changed. And understanding this principle is incredibly powerful because it changes how you interpret relationships. Instead of clinging to comforting explanations, you begin to trust observable patterns. Instead of chasing reassurance, you start paying attention to behavior. This shift in perspective protects your emotional clarity. It prevents you from wasting time trying to decode words that contradict reality. Because once you understand that behavior is the most honest form of communication, you stop searching for hidden meanings in sentences and start recognizing the truth in actions. The strongest individuals are not those who demand constant explanations. They are the ones who quietly observe what people repeatedly show them, because the reality is simple. People may control their words. They may rehearse their responses. They may carefully construct explanations, but behavior always leaves evidence. And the moment you learn to recognize that evidence, something profound happens. You stop relying on what people say they feel, and you start trusting what their actions consistently reveal. And that realization leads to a powerful truth that every person should remember. Words can create comfort, but behavior always creates clarity. And if you want to understand the true direction of any relationship, never study the promises being spoken. Study the patterns being lived. Now let's go deeper into something that many people underestimate, yet it quietly determines the direction of every relationship in your life. And that is attention. Attention is one of the most powerful psychological currencies human beings possess, yet very few people truly understand how limited it is. Every single day, every human being wakes up with a finite amount of mental and emotional energy. You cannot endlessly distribute your focus, your curiosity, your emotional presence, and your interest to multiple people at the same intensity. It simply does not work that way. The mind naturally prioritizes what feels most rewarding, most exciting, or most emotionally stimulating in that moment. This is why attention always follows emotional investment. Where the heart begins to lean, the mind soon follows. And this is where the misunderstanding often begins in many relationships. People assume that because communication still exists, everything must still be the same. They believe that as long as messages are exchanged and conversations happen occasionally, the emotional investment must still be intact. But communication alone does not prove attention. In fact, someone can communicate with you while their true attention is invested somewhere entirely different. You have probably experienced this moment in a conversation before. You are speaking to someone, sharing something important, and yet something feels off. They respond, but the responses feel automatic. Their curiosity feels weaker. Their engagement feels thinner. The conversation technically continues, but the emotional depth that once existed is no longer present. That subtle difference is the beginning of an important shift. Attention is not measured by the number of messages someone sends you. It is measured by the quality of presence they bring when they interact with you. When someone is emotionally invested, their attention feels natural and effortless. They ask questions, they remember small details, they show genuine curiosity about your thoughts, your day, your experiences. But when that emotional investment begins to move somewhere else, attention quietly begins to withdraw. And the interesting thing about human psychology is that people often believe they can control this shift. They assume they can simply maintain the same level of interaction and no one will notice the difference. But the mind does not work like that. When emotional focus shifts toward a new person or a new source of excitement, the brain naturally redirects its energy there. Think about how attraction works in the early stages of meeting someone new. When someone catches your interest, you begin thinking about them more frequently. You begin checking your phone more often. Conversations with them feel stimulating, refreshing, even addictive. Suddenly, a significant portion of your attention is dedicated to that individual. Now, here is the critical reality that many people ignore. If someone begins investing that kind of attention somewhere else, the energy they previously invested in you cannot remain unchanged. Something has to give. The mind begins reallocating its emotional resources, and the first place where that shift becomes visible is through attention. Conversations that once felt energetic begin to feel routine. Responses that once felt thoughtful begin to feel brief. Curiosity slowly disappears because curiosity is driven by emotional interest. And this is where emotional intelligence becomes extremely important. Many people misinterpret these changes. They assume the solution is to demand more attention, to ask for reassurance, or to confront the person directly. But forcing attention rarely solves anything. Genuine attention cannot be demanded. It can only be given voluntarily. The real skill is observation. When you begin observing attention patterns, you start recognizing how people truly prioritize their emotional energy. You notice who responds with enthusiasm and who responds with obligation. You notice who initiates conversation naturally and who only replies when necessary. You notice who remembers the small details of your life and who gradually stops asking about them altogether. These patterns tell a story that words often cannot, because when someone genuinely values your presence, attention flows towards you naturally. They do not have to remind themselves to engage. They do not have to force curiosity. Their interest appears spontaneously because your presence stimulates their mind. But when someone begins receiving emotional stimulation from another person, the balance inevitably shifts. Even if they attempt to maintain appearances, the depth of attention slowly fades. And this is where many people struggle emotionally. They sense the shift, but they try to convince themselves that nothing has changed. They focus on the occasional affectionate message or the rare moment of warmth, hoping that it proves the relationship is still the same. But patterns matter more than moments. Anyone can display temporary interest. Anyone can create brief moments of connection. But long-term emotional investment is revealed through consistent attention, consistent curiosity, consistent engagement. And when those elements begin disappearing, it is rarely an accident. Understanding this principle gives you a powerful advantage in navigating relationships. Instead of becoming confused by mixed signals, you begin focusing on what truly matters, where someone consistently directs their attention. You stop measuring the relationship by promises or explanations. You start measuring it by energy, presence, and engagement. And once you start observing attention this way, you realize something very important about human nature. People always make time and attention for what emotionally excites them the most. They may claim they are busy, distracted, or overwhelmed, but emotional priority always finds a way to express itself. This realization changes how you approach relationships entirely. You stop chasing attention from people who have already redirected their focus elsewhere. You stop trying to compete for emotional space in someone's mind. Instead, you begin valuing something far more powerful: mutual investment. Because the healthiest relationships are not built on constant questioning or reassurance. They are built on natural attention flowing in both directions. Two people who are genuinely curious about each other, genuinely interested in each other, and genuinely present when they interact. When that balance exists, you feel it immediately. The conversation flows effortlessly. The connection feels alive. Intention is not something you have to ask for because it is already there. And that is why attention is such a powerful indicator of emotional truth. Where attention goes, interest lives. Where attention disappears, emotional investment has already begun to fade. So instead of asking someone where their loyalty is, watch where their attention consistently travels, because attention never lies. And the moment you understand that principle, you stop chasing people's words and start paying attention to the quiet evidence their behavior leaves behind. Now, there is another principle about human behavior that many people struggle to accept, yet it quietly explains so many confusing moments inside relationships. And that principle is this: sudden behavioral changes are rarely random. Human behavior tends to follow patterns, and when those patterns shift abruptly, something in the underlying psychology has changed. Most people believe that major changes in relationships happen dramatically. They imagine a clear confession, a confrontation, or an obvious event that suddenly transforms everything. But in reality, human relationships rarely collapse or transform in a single dramatic moment. They change gradually through subtle shifts in behavior that accumulate over time. This is why emotional intelligence requires you to pay attention to patterns patterns, not isolated incidents. One late reply to a message means nothing. One busy day means nothing. One cancelled plan means nothing. Life is unpredictable, and everyone has moments when they are distracted, tired, or overwhelmed. But when you begin noticing repeated changes in how someone behaves toward you, that pattern deserves attention. Because consistency is the natural language of genuine interest. When someone values your presence in their life, their behavior tends to be stable. Their communication style remains relative, nigh predictable. Their tone remains familiar. Their level of engagement remains balanced. Even when they are busy, their effort to stay connected still feels genuine. But when a new influence begins to enter someone's emotional world, the stability of that behavior often begins to shift. You may start noticing irregular communication patterns. One day, they seem very engaged, responsive, even affectionate. The next day, they disappear for hours or days without explanation. When they finally return, the explanation feels vague or incomplete. This inconsistency can be confusing because it creates mixed signals. On some days, the connection feels normal again, and on other days, it feels distant or detached. Many people interpret this inconsistency as emotional complexity, but in many cases, it reflects divided attention. When someone is emotionally balancing multiple sources of validation, their behavior becomes unpredictable. Their schedule changes, their communication rhythm changes, their availability changes, and because they are trying to maintain appearances while managing different emotional priorities, their explanation often become inconsistent as well. Now, it is important to understand something about human psychology here. Most people do not consciously plan to deceive others. In many cases, they are navigating their own internal conflict. They are trying to maintain comfort while simultaneously exploring new emotional stimulation. This internal conflict produces behavioral instability. Sometimes they behave warmly because part of them still values the relationship they already have. Other times they withdraw because their attention has shifted somewhere else. This push and pull dynamic creates confusion for the other person because the signals they receive are constantly changing, and confusion is one of the most powerful emotional traps in relations. Says, when people receive mixed signals, they often respond by investing more effort. They try harder to understand what is happening. They ask more questions. They attempt to fix what they believe might be a misunderstanding. But the truth is that mixed signals are rarely misunderstandings. They are usually reflections of divided emotional priorities. Another sign of sudden behavioral change is increased defensiveness. When someone feels internally uneasy about their behavior, even simple questions can trigger strong emotional reactions. A normal question like, "Where were you?" or "Why didn't you respond earlier?" can suddenly provoke irritation or anger. And this reaction often surprises people. They wonder why such a simple question created such a strong response. The answer lies in psychological tension. When a person feels that their actions might be questioned, they may react defensively in order to shut down further discussion. Instead of calmly answering the question, they redirect the conversation toward the person asking it. They might say, "You are overthinking." They might say, "You are being suspicious." They might accuse you of creating problems that do not exist. But the purpose of this reaction is not clarity, it is avoidance. Defensiveness often acts as a protective shield for behavior that someone does not want to explain too deeply. And when defensiveness appears suddenly in a relationship that was previously open and calm, it often indicates that something new has entered the psychological equation. Another subtle shift appears in personal routines. People who are developing new emotional interests often begin adjusting their schedules, habits, and priorities in ways that seem unusual. Plans change unexpectedly. Time becomes harder to predict. Explanations become less specific. Again, each individual instance may appear harmless, but when these Hangjis start appearing regularly, they create a new behavioral pattern, and patterns are where the truth lives. The mistake many people make is focusing on each individual event instead of observing the pattern as a whole. They try to rationalize every single change separately, finding explanations that make each moment seem harmless. But when you step back and observe the overall pattern, the direction becomes clearer. Communication is inconsistent. Defensiveness has increased. Availability has changed. Explanations feel vague. When these signals begin appearing together, they tell a story about shifting emotional dynamics. This does not necessarily mean betrayal in every situation, but it does indicate that the emotional landscape of the relationship is no longer the same as it once was. Something has entered the equation that is influencing behavior, and recognizing this requires emotional maturity. It requires the ability to observe without immediately reacting with anger or desperation, because the goal of awareness is not to control someone's behavior. The goal is to understand the reality of the situation clearly enough to make intelligent decisions. Strong individuals do not panic when they notice behavioral changes. They simply pay attention. They observe whether the pattern continues, whether it stabilizes, or whether it deepens over time. Because the truth about human behavior is remarkably simple. Once you learn to recognize patterns, people can hide intentions with words, they can disguise emotions with explanations, they can temporarily maintain appearances. But long-term behavior cannot remain inconsistent forever without revealing the truth behind it. Eventually, patterns become impossible to ignore. And this realization leads to a powerful form of clarity in relationships. Instead of becoming trapped in endless analysis of individual moments, you begin observing the direction of someone's behavior over time, because direction reveals intention. And when someone's behavior begins moving in a new direction, the wisest response is not denial. The wisest response is awareness. So the next time you notice sudden changes in someone's behavior, do not rush to judge, but do not rush to ignore it either. Step back, observe the pattern, watch where the behavior continues to move. Because behavior rarely changes without a reason. And when you learn to recognize those changes early, you protect something far more valuable than temporary comfort. You protect your clarity. Now let us move into something deeper that very few people discuss openly when talking about relationships, yet it silently controls how people treat one another. That is the concept of power dynamics. Every relationship, whether people admit it or not, contains a balance of psychological power. This does not mean domination or control in the obvious sense. It means the invisible balance of emotional investment, attention, and perceived alternatives that shape how two people behave toward each other. In the early stages of any connection, both individuals usually invest energy in maintaining that balance. They listen carefully, they respond thoughtfully, they show patience, they demonstrate effort because the relationship still feels valuable and fragile. But the moment someone begins to believe they have additional options, something subtle begins to shift inside their psychology. Human beings behave very differently when they feel they have alternatives. This is not about morality. It is about human nature. When a person believes their attention is desired by more than one individual, their sense of emotional leverage begins to change. Suddenly, they feel less dependent on maintaining the same level of effort with the person they were previously focused on, and this shift rarely happens in a dramatic way. It appears through small behavioral adjustments that many people initially overlook. You might notice that the person becomes slightly less patient in conversations. They may interrupt more often or dismiss your perspective more quickly than before. Small disagreements that once ended calmly now feel sharper. The tolerance they once showed begins to shrink. Why does this happen? Because when someone believes they have alternatives, the urgency to protect the current connection decreases. In psychology, this is closely connected to perceived value. When something feels rare or uncertain, people treat it with greater care. But when they believe there are multiple options available, their behavior becomes more relaxed, sometimes even careless. You can see this pattern in many areas of life, not just relationships. When a person has only one opportunity, they tend to protect it carefully. When they believe they have many opportunities, they become less cautious with each one. The same pattern appears in emotional connections. If someone begins receiving attention or validation from another person, their perception of the relationship dynamic begins to shift. They may not consciously decide to treat you differently, but their behavior naturally reflects the new balance they feel internally. The warmth may decrease slightly, the responsiveness may become slower, the effort may feel reduced. And this is where many people misinterpret the situation. Instead of recognizing the shift in power dynamics, they respond by increasing their own effort. They try harder to regain the attention they feel slipping away. They send more messages. They become more accommodating. They try to prove their value through additional effort. But ironically, this reaction often intensifies the imbalance. When one person begins investing significantly more energy than the other, the psychological scale tips even further. The individual who is receiving that extra effort begins to feel even more secure in their position, while the person offering it becomes increasingly anxious about the relationship. And anxiety rarely creates attraction. Confidence and emotional stability create attraction. When someone appears calm, self-assured, and emotionally grounded, their presence naturally commands respect. But when someone begins chasing reassurance or constantly seeking validation, the dynamic becomes unstable. This is why emotional awareness is so important in these moments. When you begin noticing shifts in behavior that suggest someone feels less invested, the solution is not to increase your effort dramatically. The solution is to step back and observe the balance of investment. Ask yourself a simple question. Is the effort in this relationship still mutual? Healthy connections always maintain a sense of reciprocity. Both people show interest. Both people make time. Both people contribute energy. The dynamic feels balanced because neither person feels they must chase the other. But when that balance disappears, the relationship begins to feel heavy on one side. One person is giving attention while the other is merely receiving it. And the longer that imbalance continues, the more the power dynamic shifts in favor of the person who is less invested. Now, here is something important to understand. Recognizing this shift does not mean becoming manipulative or playing psychological games. True confidence does not require manipulation, it requires self-respect. Self-respect means recognizing when your energy is no longer being matched. It means understanding that your attention, your time, and your emotional investment have value. When you offer those things to someone who no longer appreciates them equally, you begin lowering your own position in the relationship. But when you maintain your standards and your self-respect, something interesting happens. You naturally restore balance, because people instinctively value what appears confident and self-assured. When someone senses that you are emotionally stable enough to walk away from imbalance, your presence suddenly carries more weight. This is not about punishing someone. It is about protecting your own dignity. The strongest individuals do not compete for attention. They do not beg for validation. They do not attempt to force someone to recognize their worth. They simply observe the behavior they are receiving and adjust their own investment accordingly. If the respect remains mutual, the relationship continues to grow. If the balance disappears, they step back with clarity rather than desperation. This level of emotional discipline changes the entire dynamic of how people interact with you. Instead of being someone who chases approval, you become someone who quietly commands respect, and respect is the true foundation of any meaningful connection. Because attraction may begin a relationship, but respect determines whether it survives. So when you begin noticing subtle shifts in power dynamics, do not panic and do not react impulsively. Simply observe the balance of effort, attention, and respect, because the moment you stop chasing what is uncertain and start valuing your own emotional presence, you send a powerful message without saying a single word. And that message is simple. Your attention is not something to be taken for granted. Now let us come to the final and perhaps the most powerful idea in this entire discussion, and that is emotional intelligence. Because everything we have talked about so far, attention, behavioral patterns, and power dynamics, becomes useful when a person develops the ability to observe these things without losing emotional control. Many people believe emotional intelligence means being sensitive or understanding toward others. That is part of it, but the deeper meaning is much more important. Emotional intelligence is the ability to see reality clearly without letting your emotions distort what you are observing. And this becomes extremely important in relationships because relationships often trigger strong emotional reactions. When someone begins behaving differently, when attention begins to shift, or when the balance of effort changes, the natural human response is anxiety. People start asking questions in their minds. Did I do something wrong? Why are they acting like this? Maybe I just need to try harder. But the problem with these thoughts is that they come from fear rather than clarity. When someone is emotionally attached to an outcome, their mind begins searching for explanations that protect the relationship instead of revealing the truth. This is why many intelligent people ignore obvious behavioral patterns in their relationships. They are not incapable of seeing the signs. They are emotionally invested in not wanting those signs to be real. And that is where emotional intelligence becomes the difference between clarity and confusion. Emotionally intelligent individuals do something very different when they begin noticing changes in behavior. Instead of reacting immediately, they step back and observe. They watch the pattern. They notice whether the shift is temporary or consistent. They notice whether effort is still mutual or slowly disappearing. They notice whether respect and engagement are still present. Observation gives them information, and information gives them control over their decisions. What they do not do is chase explanations. This is a mistake that many people make. When they sense emotional distance, they try to force clarity through confrontation. They ask repeated questions, hoping the other person will explain everything honestly and restore their sense of security. But the reality is that clarity rarely comes from forcing someone to talk. Clarity comes from watching what people consistently do. If someone values your presence, their actions will show it repeatedly. If someone's attention has shifted elsewhere, their behavior will reveal that shift through patterns over time. Words may attempt to soften the situation, but behavior always tells the deeper story. Emotionally intelligent people understand this, which is why they do not become trapped in endless emotional analysis. They focus on evidence rather than promises. And this approach changes everything about how they experience relationships. Instead of feeling powerless, they become calm observers. They notice shifts in attention without immediately assuming blame. They recognize changes in behavior without desperately trying to repair something that may already be changing naturally. This calm awareness gives them a kind of quiet strength that many people misunderstand. Because emotional intelligence is not loud. It does not involve dramatic confrontations or emotional reactions. It is silent, patient, and extremely perceptive. When someone with strong emotional intelligence begins to see consistent patterns that suggest the relationship dynamic is shifting, they do something very simple but very powerful. They adjust their own behavior. They stop over investing in someone who is no longer investing equally. They stop chasing attention that is no longer freely given. They stop trying to convince someone to value their presence. Instead, they maintain their dignity. This is not about pride or ego. It is about self-respect. Self-respect means recognizing that your time, your emotional energy, and your attention are valuable. They should be shared with people who genuinely appreciate them, not constantly questioned or negotiated. And when you begin operating from that mindset, something interesting happens. You stop fearing the possibility of losing someone because you understand something deeper about relationships. The goal of a relationship is not simply to keep someone in your life at any cost. The goal is to share your life with someone whose behavior consistently reflects genuine respect, interest, and appreciation. When those qualities disappear, holding on desperately does not restore them. Sometimes the most intelligent response is simply to step back and allow reality to reveal itself fully. If the connection is genuine, it will rebalance itself naturally. If it is not, the distance will become clearer over time. Either way, emotional intelligence protects you from wasting energy trying to force something that is no longer naturally present. And this brings us to one final truth that many people discover too late. You cannot control another person's choices. You cannot control where their attention goes, who they become interested in, or how their feelings evolve over time. But you can control how clearly you observe their behavior. And you can control how much of your own energy you invest in response to that behavior. That is real emotional power. It is the ability to stay calm when others become inconsistent. It is the ability to trust patterns instead of empty reassurances. And it is the ability to walk away from confusion with your dignity intact. Because the strongest individuals in any relationship are not the ones who demand love. They are the ones who recognize when love, respect, and attention are no longer being given freely. And when they see that truth, clearly, they do something that many people are too afraid to do. They stop chasing what is uncertain and start valuing themselves enough to wait for what is genuine. And once you reach that level of emotional clarity, something profound changes inside you. You no longer need to ask people where you stand. Their behavior already tells you everything you need to know.